By 1812, Europe was in absolute chaos. The French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon had resulted in most of the continent being conquered by the rapidly expanding French Empire. Britain was quick to take an opposing stance against this growing threat, which would start the Napoleonic Wars. In North America, the United States was especially hit hard by these developments going on in the Old World. Both the British and the French decided to cease trade towards any nation that didn't outright support their causes in the war, and as the US was not planning to get involved, Thomas Jefferson signed an act that would ban any trade on American ports. However, this would only contribute to a weakening of the US economy, leading the country into an economic depression. In the face of such crisis, Thomas Jefferson repealed the act and decided to lift the trade restrictions to both Britain and France, with the condition that whichever side decides to repeal their own restrictions first, the US would resume an embargo on the opposing nation. Napoleon, being the diplomatic genius that he is, was able to steer British-American relations to an all-time low. This, combined with accusations that the British were taking American sailors and employing them into their army in a strategy known as impressment, and British aid towards native resistance taking place on American soil, the stage was set for an armed confrontation between the two powers. Thus, on June 18, 1812, the Americans issued a formal war declaration against the United Kingdom, officially kickstarting the War of 1812. With Britain busy in Europe, the Americans hoped to seize Canada from them, thinking it would be a walk in the park. However, that's not how things unfolded in this war. Despite on paper America being able to militarily compete with the British, they faced significant defeats and humiliations in the early stages of the war. Specifically, at the Battle of Detroit, the American forces led by William Hull would come face to face with Native American troops led by Tecumseh and aided by the British. Fearing a bloodbath that would come about as a result of a Native American victory, Hull opted to surrender Detroit and by extension Michigan over to enemy forces. To add insult to injury, as the Americans attempted to invade Canada by launching an operation in Queenston Heights, the British forces would humiliate them once more, despite the fact that Major British General Isaac Brock was killed during the battle. Yet the American Navy did manage to score a major victory against the British one in Lake Erie, sending American morale for the war sky high. Even more so, as the Battle of the Thames raged on, Tecumseh would be killed, and the organized Native American resistance would fall on that very battle. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the coalition forces have reached Paris and Napoleon would be exiled to the island of Elba, which would finally allow the British to bring their full force to the showdown. Soon, the British would land a force in Washington, D.C. before promptly burning down the White House. They would then attempt to march further north, but the Americans would defeat them in the Battle of North Point, at which point peace negotiations between the two powers would ensue. After the war, things pretty much returned to how they were previously. The British ended hostilities with the United States by lifting trading restrictions, and stopped supporting any native resistance against the US. Overall, this war is seen as a victory by both sides, and the only true losers of this conflict were the Native Americans. For the British, Canada was secured under their flag, while the Americans managed to normalize relations with Britain and secure all of the former native territories, paving the way for future American expansion towards the West. But could this war have went differently? Historically, the British had proven that they could still dominate the young state, and they performed admirably during the war, even when they had to face what was arguably the best general of all time. Thus, this raises the obvious question: what if the British won the War of 1812? Well, for this to happen, not much really needs to be altered too drastically. The British already had an excellent performance at the start of the war, managing to defend Canada and capturing Detroit. Still, we can have them perform just slightly better, defeating the Americans in the Battle of Lake Erie, and most importantly, preventing the death of Tecumseh in the Battle of the Thames. This should allow the British to get naval dominance in the Great Lakes and secure continued support from the Native Americans, massively boosting their war effort. Still, by far the main focus of the British is defeating Napoleon, and committing any more to the North American front is quite unreasonable considering the situation back home. However, this is all about to change as France is defeated and Napoleon faces exile in Elba. Britain can now turn their full attention over to the US, and this is where the war takes a really drastic turn. As the British forces land in Washington, they would meet with the American army in the Battle of North Point, before proceeding to wipe the floor with them. This would open the gates to the city of Philadelphia, which would fall soon after, inflicting major damage to the American morale. Furthermore, two more landings would take place, the first one in Boston and the other one in Louisiana, with the Americans not being able to effectively use the Mississippi River due to the British occupation of Louisiana, and with major cities including the capital falling to enemy hands, the US would be forced to surrender and the peace deals will be brutal. First, Britain will annex a good chunk of disputed territory in Maine, while the natives of the Midwest would gain their independence under close British oversight. But arguably most devastatingly, the Louisiana territory is returned to the Spanish. The US, now forced to the East Coast, is significantly weaker, ensuring that they could not stand up to Britain in the short term. But before we continue, if you're enjoying the content thus far, consider subscribing. It is the channel's goal to reach 6,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so doing so will mean a lot. Anyways, let's get back with the video. The natives for their part have gotten a way better deal than they did in our timeline. To the north, Tecumseh, alongside with his brother Tenskwatawa, have established a native confederation with guaranteed support from London. The Confederacy will embark upon a Reconquista effort against the American settlers, hoping to solidify their control over the territory. With British aid, most of the Americans would be kicked out, and further American expansion into the territory would be deemed cause for war. On top of that, a policy of revitalization of the culture would take place, where the native confederacy would embrace traditional values and reject European ones. But the fortunes for the Native Americans don't end here, as moving to the south we notice an interesting quirk. While the US has technically already established states and territories in the area, in practice these lands are controlled by Native Americans known as the Five Civilized Tribes, which include the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes. Historically, as the US expanded its grip across America, these people have faced many hardships, with their territory slowly being reduced in size. Then, as President Andrew Jackson introduced the Indian Removal Act, these five tribes were forcibly removed from their homeland and relocated to the territory of Oklahoma, with many of them dying along the way. However, in this timeline, with the US being much smaller and overall weaker, the five civilized tribes can mount a more serious resistance against the central government. This would be especially meaningful considering the fact that Tecumseh's confederacy would likely support their efforts of independence, hoping to incorporate them into the confederation, which would be a checkmate towards American power projection in that region. However, in the short term, these calls remain quiet, as I don't expect the American government to accept another humiliating loss right after 1812. Speaking of the Americans, politically the state is altered quite a bit. Historically, during the War of 1812, there existed two main political parties within the United States. The Democratic Republicans, who wished for the expansion of the Union in all directions and for more autonomy for each state, and the Federalists, who hoped for a smaller union and a more powerful central government. The Federalists were already deeply unpopular by 1812, at which point they decided to oppose the war which, to the American public, the US was winning. This pretty much ended the already weak Federalists as a force within the Union. However, in this scenario, the Federalists would likely see a short-lived political revival, as their opposition to the War of 1812 would have gathered them many new supporters. Still, don't expect this to last for too long, as the nation is now dominated by the southern states, which are fundamentally opposed to the core values the Federalist Party holds. Meanwhile, this American defeat has affected the internal slave state abolition state balance that existed within the US beforehand. With the loss of the Great Lakes area and the Louisiana Territory, the United States is now disproportionately dominated by the southern slave states. The slavery dispute would likely remain unresolved, as the practice would last for decades longer than it did in our timeline. Furthermore, instead of a bloody civil war we saw in our timeline, we would likely see an internal separation between the North and the South, with the northern states becoming much closer to Britain, while the southern ones turned the nation into a more confederate model, with hopes to still expand it all the way to the Pacific. But enough with US politics, let's shift our focus over to something more impactful: the Mexican War of Independence. During the Napoleonic Wars in 1808, Napoleon decided to depose the Spanish king and replace him with his brother Joseph, effectively turning Spain into a puppet of France. This as a result created a lot of resentment from the colonies, which now sought their full independence from Spain. Mexico was no exception, and in 1810 the struggle for Mexican independence would begin. In this timeline, assuming the War of 1812 ended around the same time as it did historically, Mexico would still be in the early stages of its rebellion, and Britain would have seen little problem with giving the Spanish back the Louisiana Territory. However, by the end of the decade, the Mexican rebels would have practically secured control over most of the state. Britain, wary of losing influence over Louisiana, would negotiate with the Mexicans trade privileges over the territory, and in exchange would agree to slightly aid their independence war. Thus, the Spanish Empire of North America would come to an end, and in its place a new state would end up forming, the First Mexican Empire. But as strong as they may look on this map, the reality underground is quite disappointing. From its inception, Mexico was a largely backward state, with its economy being mostly agricultural, while most of the country was still under native rule. Though yes, Mexico in theory controls some of the richest land in all of the American continent, in practice they don't, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to use them effectively and take advantage of them. This would become quite a significant issue for the already struggling nation, as American settlers pour into its newly acquired territory. Though Britain, in the short term at least, would not tolerate an American influx into Tecumseh's Confederacy, Mexico is in no position to fight back against the invading American horde. What is likely to happen is that the American settlers would found their own state, similar to what happened to Texas in our timeline, which the Mexican government would obviously not recognize. The US, meanwhile, would not be keen on annexing these states right away, as political division within the nation threatens to tear it apart if such plans do pass, and especially since the new countries would most likely become slave states, further alienating the abolitionist one. Zooming out, let's discuss Britain for a bit, as I have mostly left them on the sidelines throughout this video, and that is for good reason. The fact of of the matter is, the British by this point would have little interest left in America, as new opportunities would have rose up elsewhere. With China declining, it only makes sense for the British to focus on securing economic concessions from the Chinese, rather than bashing their heads against the US for seemingly no rewards. That's not to say that the British would just give up on North America fully though. With Britain being the champion of abolitionism in the whole world, it would seem quite hypocritical for them to allow a nation that is highly dependent on slavery to expand into their territory and get away with it without any consequences. As a result, the situation in North America would remain tense for the next few decades, but for now no major war is in sight, at least on this continent. As in Europe, the Crimean War would take place around the same time as it did in our timeline. Historically, after the war, Russia decided to sell Alaska over to the United States, as they feared losing the territory to Britain in a follow-up war. However, since in this timeline the US is much less established on the world stage, and they still remain a regional power at best, Russia may look for alternative customers. To me personally, the most likely candidates are either Mexico or Britain. But since Mexico would still be a poor and relatively backward state, I don't see them wanting to buy a territory which had unknown benefits at the time. This just leaves Britain, an arch rival of the Russians in both Central Asia and China. Still, with there being little perceived value in Alaska during that time, and since the Russians desperately needed that money, I think it's somewhat plausible that the Russians sell Alaska over to Britain in exchange for large monetary compensation. But soon another major shakeup will hit the world as Prussia defeats France and forms the German Empire. With geopolitical tension in Europe rapidly escalating, the Germans would form the Triple Alliance and the French the Entente Cordiale. As a result of the massive naval buildup Germany became committed to, the British would become increasingly concerned and would start growing closer to the Entente with each passing moment. The American government realizes that this is their chance to strike. Germany would invite the US over to the Central Powers, promising to avenge the War of 1812 and then some. Still, with the North being sympathetic towards the British, any war declaration might light up the fuse of an American Civil War. At the same time, in the West, Mexico is already deep within their Industrial Revolution, and with their current territory being amongst the richest in North America, they are slowly becoming a semi-significant regional power. With their added strength, they would be able to deal with the natives more effectively, or rather compromise with them, and they are now preparing for their ultimate reconquista of their former territory. World War I is on the horizon, and what would end up happening to the North American continent and the whole world remains up in the air. And with this image in your mind, I am going to end the scenario here. I hope you enjoyed the content, and if you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe and comment below what you thought of the video. And as always, don't forget to join the Discord linked in the description below. Anyways, have a great rest of your day and goodbye.